Hey guys, welcome back. Been a couple of weeks. I've been busy with work, but it's time for another security stories. This one is going to upset maybe some of the guys, but bear with me. It's about the subject of misogyny. And before you start in at me, I have done several other videos talking about the pitfalls of dealing with some types of girls that are out there, and like the video on the strip clubs and how men are getting rinsed in those places. So I'm talking about the negative sides of people's personalities and breaking that up into the likely behaviors by gender of some people within that gender. So firstly, I'm not talking about all men or all women, and I'm breaking it up by gender because there is a difference between the way the two behave. Women don't tend to go around just punching people in the face randomly, and guys don't tend to go around sort of ruining people's reputation and gossiping behind their backs. As a general rule, of course, you do get outliers in those. But this time I'm going to be talking about misogyny because I think it's a really important subject. I was actually quite shocked recently. I left a couple of comments on a Facebook thread, and the thread was about a news story where a guy had been, very coercive and violent towards his partner because she had had a previous partner. The name had been tattooed on her, and that had led to some altercations between them. And I was amazed actually at the amount of guys defending his actions despite him being a violent, unpleasant guy, and they'd been defending his actions in the comment section. And I just put on there that my girlfriend, for 17 years I've been with her, she has a ex's name tattooed on her foot. She has a whole bunch of tattoos, and that's never been an issue for me. I'm not an insecure guy. I'm not a guy that needs to own his girlfriend. I don't give her commands. She has for a long time wanted it off, but for various different reasons, that she just never got round to it, and it still remains there. And frankly, neither of us care about it. We didn't even think about it until this news story came up. So that was kind of my comment, that no one owns anyone. We shouldn't be trying to control people. And if they're not doing, if we've got a hard line in the sand about something we want from a partner and they refuse to cooperate with our, hard line that we've set, then you just leave the relationship. You say to the person, you're not meeting the standards I am looking for in a prospective partner that I want to settle down with. Therefore, I'm going to walk out of the relationship and leave. What you don't do is trying to control them to live by your set of standards, because we're all individuals. We all have our own standards that we live by, and it's our job to find a compatible set in another person that we can both kind of compromise and be happy with. Anyway, that's what led me to this video, because it struck me, I started thinking about this. And obviously I've been around a hell of a lot of very bad behaviour from males towards females. And again, I'll reiterate, that's not all males. But I will be talking in this video about how I found that the males that did and said nothing were just as guilty as the males that were perpetuating this kind of behaviour. And that was very, very common. So where do we start? I think I saw a lot of bad behaviour, and I'd first start by kind of breaking it up into the two quite clear categories that I saw from my perspective doing the security work. The first one, I think it's one that's less concerning, although people should be aware about it, and it's something that I find males grow out of. So the first one is like when young males, they're full of testosterone, they're emotionally dumb. All young males under the age of about 25, they've got all these hormones raging around in them, and they just don't know what to do with them. They're pretty emotionally stupid, and they don't really know how to handle girls too well. And they often fall head over heels with a girl, and that feeling isn't always returned. You add that to the fact that young males also really care about what their peer group thinks. There's this whole deal about, I want to look like the top guy, the badass, the guy that gets all the girls, whether that be in terms of I want to be the strongest guy or the guy that's like the super attractive guy. the guy that never gets turned down for a date. You know, all those things are important to young men because they're trying to impress their peer group. So the nightclub scene is a kind of dangerous combination there, because you've got these emotionally immature young boys. They then add alcohol to the mix and possibly some recreational drugs as well. So that's going to dampen their ability to, you know, have kind of clear emotions and clear strategies moving forward. And then they've got these hormones raging in them. They see all the girls who are clearly dressed up to impress, and the girls might be trying to impress each other or just did it for themselves. But the reaction is obviously that the boys are in a heightened state of interest because of the way the girls are looking. The girls are kind of dancing in a way that the guys are finding interesting, clearly. And we could all discuss that all day about, you know, whether it's provocative or whether or not, you know, the girls want the reaction from the guys. None of that actually matters. The reality of this is that if you wear, you know, outfits where a lot of skin's on display and you dance around in a sensual manner, you might be doing that for yourself, you might be doing it for your girlfriends, but young males who are straight will 100% find that incredibly alluring and attractive, and they will be magnetized towards you. And some of them you will maybe like, and some of them you won't like. You know, that's the facts. I don't really have an opinion either way on you know, like the idea that it's like victim blaming or whatever. I think that's all pointless discussion. We just need to focus on, you know, young males are attracted by those things and they are drawn over there. So you then have this terrible combination, right? And what tends to happen is the young male gets turned down, and that can lead to some very unpleasant situations. At the very least, I saw loads and loads of times just vile language from the young guys, you know, calling the girls all kinds of names. They would normally immediately insinuate that the girl was like some sort of sexually promiscuous name. You can guess the sort of names they would go for, or suggest that the girl was really ugly, or try and, you know, play it off and say, I didn't want to go out with you anyway, you know, I was just doing it for a dare, I actually think you're horrible looking, and just saying really graphic and horrible stuff. Of course that is upsetting for the girls. No one wants to see that. When we came across it, we would obviously throw these guys out straight away. And I kind of felt that that guy was making a really stupid mistake. You know, he was trying to show off in a way that he thought would preserve his masculinity in front of his young male friends. And like I said, he's emotionally immature, so he doesn't actually understand really what masculinity is, and he doesn't really understand how he should preserve that. So he's just kind of floundering around, you know, in this sea of emotions that he isn't clearly understanding. You know, a guy that really was masculine in that situation would go over, offer to talk to the girls, buy them a drink, whatever, have a nice conversation with them. If there seemed to be some sparks going on, he might offer his number and say, hey, I would like to see you again sometime. And if they didn't return to his call and nothing came of it, he's not bothered, right? He's moving on, because who cares? He's confident, he's got his own life going on, he's happy within his own skin. He doesn't need validation off a bunch of other people stood around him. He's just going to, you know, try his hand, ask a girl that he really likes out, and if she says no, that so be it. And he may, you know, carry on being friendly towards that girl. Maybe down the line the relationship will develop, because it's actually surprising the amount of girls that would immediately say no to a guy, probably because they're so fed up with being hit on, and they're so fed up with guys that want like a short-term situation, you know, just a one-night stand thing. But if the guys were actually confident enough and had a, you know, strong enough ego that they could go back, you know, a couple of weeks later and bump into that girl and say, hey, you know, how you doing? We spoke last time. Really nice to see you. Do you want another drink? That could happen 2 or 3 times. Eventually that girl's going to think, wow, this guy actually does have a real interest in me, and maybe this is something that I'm considering now. You know, so it kind of pays not to be persistent in an unpleasant way like a creep or harassing, but to be a friendly person just in general. And you might note that a lot of the guys that go clubbing that are super friendly in general to everyone, men and women, they end up with a lot of different girlfriends because girls like guys that are just down there being super friendly. Kind of obvious, right? So you would get that type of misogyny, which I think people grew out of. You know, it wasn't like this sort of deep-rooted, sinister, evil thing, but it could still boil over. You know, there were situations where that kind of thing could lead to violence. And certainly, you know, if those people went on a date, for example, if that girl said, yeah, sure, I'll see you, and then she like shatters that guy's ego, you know, a couple of times later, she says to him, actually, when we slept together, it wasn't that great. I don't really like you that much. I want to break up. That's where there's a dangerous situation. And we saw a lot of that in clubs, that people would come in, you know, it'd be their like second or third date or whatever, or they've been dating a few months. Things would go badly wrong in the club, normally because alcohol was involved. And sure enough, the guy would take it badly again because he was massively emotionally immature. Girls tend to be a lot more emotionally mature than guys at these young ages. And sometimes that could then move into a sort of violent situation. There were several times where girls had been like gripped around the throat, that these guys were trying to like control them in some way. Girls had occasionally been hit. Obviously in those points we would grab the guy, throw him out, and ring the police in some cases. A lot of the times the girls would beg us, you know, not to hurt the guy, not to ring the police, and people struggle to understand this situation, you know, but the girls had often been in a relationship with these guys for a long enough period of time that they liked them, loved them in some cases, but also knew that they couldn't be together because the relationship was toxic. So it left them in this weird like middle ground where they wanted to be away from them, but they didn't want them hurt necessarily, which is adverse to what a lot of guys think. A lot of guys would just think, oh, you just go up and punch the guy in the face, you know, she'll be really happy about it. Most of the time they're not actually really happy if you go and do that. I learned the hard way when I was 17. I think I mentioned this in the video before. I saw a girl getting kicked in the head on the floor in front of me on the side of the road, and I ran over. It was actually in the middle of the road. I ran over there, hit the guy immediately because he was a big guy, and you know, I had to make a preemptive strike. So it was perfectly legal what I did because she was in danger of dying for sure. He was literally rugby kicking her in the head. So I knocked him clean out, just running out. You know, I took a sucker punch on him, and like in the streets, there is no hey man, do you want to go with some Queensbury rules and let's all stand up and do a boxing match? No, if you're going to deal with a situation, you just deal with it as strategically and as deceptively as you possibly can. That's how that kind of thing works. And he was out on the floor. I put my hand out as a young doorman, 17, thinking, oh, she's going to be so pleased, you know, and I felt like some kind of knight in shining armour, and she immediately took her stiletto off and started trying to hack at my head with it because she was upset that I had hurt her partner. So I quickly learned that that wasn't maybe the best way to go about dealing with relationship breakups. But back to what I'm talking about, I hope that, you know, if girls are listening here, especially young girls going to nightclubs, that they understand that they're entering in to a possibly very dangerous situation. You know, unrequited love really spurns like the worst types of behaviours in men, especially when they're drunk. But even when they're not drunk, those emotionally immature men, they often are not particularly happy with where they're at in their lives, because at that young age they probably haven't achieved much career-wise. They're probably still struggling to assert themselves in their peer group in terms of physicality and stuff like that. So they're desperate to kind of achieve something, and they cling on to the, you know, beautiful girlfriend situation, the girl that they really want. And it's like their whole life is dependent on that, you know, that they put so much into it that they feel like if that relationship breaks, there's so much more at stake than just not seeing that person again. It becomes their whole life is crashing down. And when someone's got a lot to lose, that is really a big concern. You know, when a young boy has got a lot to lose, he often isn't thinking about consequences of actions because he's young and full of testosterone and kind of stupid. And he may do something incredibly stupid and incredibly dangerous because he perceives at that point that the rest of his life isn't worth continuing with. And we definitely dealt with some young guys like that, you know, that in the cold light of day, if I could have sat with them like a kind of social worker and chatted it out and made them understand some things, you know, I could have probably got them out of thinking like that if I think back. But it didn't matter because at the time they were making some really bad decisions, you know, and they'd already come to that conclusion, and we didn't have time to sit down with them for 3.5 hours over cups of coffee and talk through their possible future options and show them from a more mature man's point of view how things can be good, you know. It's not dependent on other people. You don't need anything from anyone else to be happy in life. The happiness is all within your own grasp. For every different individual, we can all be happy within ourselves, and we have that within us. We have the ability to find happiness within us. If you happen to get a partner along for the ride, that's fantastic. That can make, you know, it can like times the happiness by 10, but that shouldn't be what you're dependent on for that sort of seed of happiness to start with. You should be able to find that yourself. And that's kind of what I would have wanted to explain to these young men. You know, they were chasing this like thread of happiness just through purely a relationship and a singular person, and that's why it became so detrimental if that broke up. So that's kind of that. And the good news is that those guys tended to grow out of it. You know, I did the door for like 20 plus years, and I would see some of these guys mature and go from complete idiots to nice young men with decent jobs. And as I've just described, you know, they would find their own happiness. They would succeed in the workplace. They would have hobbies that they were doing well with that would please them. They would, you know, maybe go to the gym, develop themselves, fit in with their peer group, you know, find their place in that hierarchy, be happy about where they were, go on to have a very happy and meaningful relationship. So in those cases, like a leopard could kind of change its spots, but I think it's difficult because there's a differentiation between those guys and some other misogynistic guys that I saw operating, that things were rooted a lot deeper. So the second kind were, you know, guys of all different ages, and, you know, quite a few doormen fell into this category, that they simply hated women. And luckily it wasn't a lot of men, you know, it was a small amount. What surprised me is the amount of men around these guys that would actually put up with that kind of behaviour. So you had these guys making, you know, really disgusting statements about women, sometimes treating women horrifically in front of people, sometimes even beating up women in front of groups of people, and people would just ignore it or say, oh well, you know, that's the kind of relationship they've got or whatever. To me, that's completely unacceptable. You know, if you think of yourself as a masculine man, then you should never ever tolerate another guy, no matter how big he is or what he looks like or who he is, whether he's your boss or whether he's like under you at work or whatever it is. If someone is doing something or saying something that is morally absolutely disgusting, then your job as a man is to speak up about it and kind of call that person out immediately, right to their face, you know, in front of everyone. Not to wait till later and sort of quietly have a word with them so it saves their face. It's to say right there and then, this is unacceptable, and to draw a line in the sand there and let them know that that line has been drawn, you know. And I would say to these guys, you know, you cannot be behaving like that. I'm going to take you out of the club now. Generally they would get unpleasant. Generally I would then wrap an arm around their neck and drag them out of the club. And sometimes, you know, they didn't want me to do that. So sometimes things got a little bit out of hand, and those guys, you know, I would act in self-defense, and those guys would leave the club unconscious, being dragged out of the club, and that was fine by me as well. But my main point is, you don't have to be, like a capable physical guy to do this. You just need to actually stand up and say, no, this is unacceptable. And whether you're going to report that to see, to say it's unacceptable and then report it further up a chain, report it to the police if it's something that serious. But whatever you do, you should make sure that you're not putting up with that, because I saw that so many times. These weak guys, you would generally get a guy that was very controlling, and like I say, he was this sort of second category of misogynism that I would witness. Basically a Neanderthal guy that was a narcissist that would never change. He was just born like that. He would stay like that. He felt that women were just there to kind of serve his needs. In fact, everyone in the world was there to serve his needs. Women just tended to interest these guys because obviously they were attracted to women in general. But equally, you would find narcissists that were gay, that were abusive to their partners. I know that's a big thing on the lesbian scene as well. There's a lot of domestic violence that goes on there. But my experience specifically was with these straight relationships. And these guys weren't going to change, and people were kind of scared of them because they tended, they were physical guys. They tended to be very, very full of themselves. They were narcissists, obviously, so they were manipulative. Often those type of people are quite magnetic in terms of their personality. I actually find them abhorrent, but when you're young and you're a man and there's some sort of cocky guy, it's easy to confuse that with, you're impressed with his confidence. And so when he does some unpleasant stuff, you just stand by and watch and don't say anything. Or worse, you actually find yourself like agreeing with it, cheering it on, whatever. Those guys should be avoided at all costs. The problem is it's very difficult to differentiate those two. And as much as young men are attracted to these type of guys in terms of, I want to hang out with that guy, he seems super confident and pretty cool, and he's pretty strong and I'm a little bit scared of him. Equally, young girls see that kind of narcissistic behaviour, and you can have a guy that's quite misogynistic, that's like openly saying really unpleasant things about women, and young girls can still be attracted to that guy because they're looking for a confident man. And when young girls haven't really established what they understand to be confidence because they're immature at that age, they get confused and they think that this cocky, brash, manipulative attitude is, they confuse that with confidence and they're attracted to it. And I think that's generally where the trope of girls being attracted to bad guys come from. I don't think that they really want a bad guy. No girl wants to date a guy that's going to beat her around or anything. But they're attracted to the confidence traits that these guys exhibit. And it's not, of course, until they actually end up in a relationship they realise that brashness and that cocky, arrogant, narcissistic attitude isn't really displaying true confidence. It's just a narcissist being a narcissist, and by then of course it's too late. So it's important to kind of work out who you're dealing with, and if you're a young girl, for sure, you really need to kind of check these things, because the last thing, that's one of the most important things you're going to do in terms of your personal safety, is enter into any sort of relationship, even a one night stand or a dance and a kiss or whatever. That sort of gateway through to that relationship is one of the most important decisions you're going to make in terms of your own personal safety, because you could be opening that door to someone who's going to be really nice to you. Equally, you could be opening a door to someone who's going to bombard you with disgusting abuse and is going to physically attack you, and even worse, may even kill you. We never came across any girls that had been killed, but I've certainly seen that on the news. But seeing the anger and the unpleasantness from some of these guys, it wouldn't surprise me in the least if we had to come across that, because we had to break up some really horrendous situations. We often had girls come in that were being stalked by exes that would tell us that their exes had raped them. All kinds of horrific stuff had happened to them. So I go back to the you know, what I was talking about in the first place, which is the guys that are truly confident are the guys that are just being friendly. You know, they're not there like jumping on like a dating thing straight away. They're coming in, they're having a good time, they're enjoying themselves, they're able to enjoy themselves just because they're, you know, they've learnt to have fun in their own body, in their own skin, without anyone else needing to kind of add the fun for them. I would avoid the guys that desperately need alcohol or drugs to kind of give them that pleasure. And if you can find these guys that are just generally friendly guys that are, you know, moving from person to person, having a good time and a good night, and you see them on a regular basis, it's a pretty reasonable assumption that they're going to be a fairly safe bet. And the guy that kind of swings over and gives you a load of like cocky, arrogant charm straight off and might be a kind of a bit rude, which you go, oh, it's kind of cool because he's being cocky or whatever, that's the red flag guy, right? That's the guy that's like more likely to kick the crap out of you. And the guy that just is coming in on a regular basis and being nice to everyone and maybe ask you out for a drink, he's kind of the guy that is the, of the two, is the safest gamble. And I would also add, there is no safe gambles in any relationship. You know, even if I enter into a relationship with another male, in terms of friendship, there's a danger aspect. You know, like when you let people into your lives, you've always got to consider that there is something that they can now do to you because they are aware of you, they know you exist, they know some things about you, maybe they know what car you drive, where you live, all these different things. And there are just really unpleasant people out there sometimes. Luckily not that many of them, but they do exist, and they will, you know, try to do some unpleasant things to you, whether that be like defrauding you, robbing you, you know, vandalizing your car, all kinds of stuff, weird stuff that human beings do to each other out of jealousy, out of spite, out of just because they're messed up in the head and they want to make people suffer. But you know, we should be aware whatever we're getting into. So I think that kind of sums up the two specific types of misogyny I've seen. I've certainly lost a lot of friends through this. Like I mentioned before, I had a few dormant friends or acquaintances, work acquaintances, whatever you want to call them, that I had to call out and say enough is enough. One guy, I'd known for 3 or 4 years, and he was exactly this type, right? He was good looking, physically in good shape. He was like a sparkly eyed, pretty boy, you know, tanned body. A lot of girls like this dude. And he ended up beating the crap out of his girlfriend in a pub in front of a whole bunch of people, literally a full pub. I wasn't actually there at the time, but I had a phone call. Someone rang me up and said, you know, your mate has just literally beaten this girl unconscious. And I knew the girl as well. She was a really nice girl. And I got hold of him straight away. You know, I rang him up. I said, I need to come around and see you. Went round there, and he was kind of looking sheepish, so he knew what I was going to say. And I said, you know, is this true? I've just heard this has happened. And he said, yeah, like she deserved it. She had been messing around, he had found that she had gone around some other bloke's house. And I said, look, none of that matters to me. What matters to me is that, you know, you should just walk away. That's the behaviour that I would do myself. That's what I expect from people that I associate with. So unfortunately I won't be able to associate with you ever again. And if I'm ever in the area and that happens, you know that I will step in and know that I will do you significant harm in order to stop you doing someone else significant harm. And to be fair, he was kind of okay with that. He was actually disappointed because we had a reasonable friendship. We would spend quite a bit of spare time in each other's company. So it's sad when you have to do that, but there's some friendships that just are not worth, you know, I could have sort of taken the thing of, oh, maybe he's going to get better, but actually he had all the red flags of a narcissist. He just had realised that he wasn't manipulating or doing anything bad to me because he was kind of wary of me in that way. But he was certainly, later I found out, you know, like that to quite a few other people as well. It just wasn't done in front of me. And, you know, that brings me to the kind of like, you can't punish these people and remove the bad points of their personality. People would sort of say to me, oh, if you know, bashed him about a bit, he would stop behaving like that. I'm like, no, he wouldn't. You know, I've actually experimented with that, and all it teaches these guys is they stop behaving like that in front of me. That's all it teaches them. They will go home behind closed doors and get away with the exact same stuff as they did before. They will still beat their wife, girlfriend, whatever, but in front of me they will smile sweetly and pretend like nothing bad has happened. And actually, you know, if they're worried the girlfriend was going to tell me something that they've been up to, they would just simply control her and not allow her ever to come and speak to me again. So that doesn't particularly help. You know, you can't sort of, you know, you see in a lot of films like a dad says to the guy, if you ever lay a finger on my daughter again, I'm going to kick the shit out of you. And the dad like punches him a couple of times or whatever. And in the film, the guy's like, fine, I'm going to be a good boyfriend now. That does not happen. Not a realistic situation whatsoever. I hope that has been of some educational value as well as some interest. You know, I really like to make these videos that I really hope that young people get something out of them, or parents might watch them and get their young people to have a look, because it's all based in what I experienced and what I saw. I'm not an academic. I'm not some university guy writing a bunch of paperwork which is kind of interpretive and maybe, you know, based on some academia somewhere, but it's not normally based in reality, or certainly not based in actual experience. And I want people to understand that this stuff happens. It certainly happened many times in front of me, so you shouldn't be surprised as a young person going out. Whether you're a young male and you want to prevent yourself acting like this, because part of the solution is to realise that you can act like this, because I've had these feelings as a young male. You know, we all have testosterone. We all had those feelings of like, oh, I'm so angry that this girl's made me look stupid or whatever. But you have to be strong enough to internalise that, you know, take it out in the gym, whatever. But what you don't do is take it out on the girl. And if you're a young girl, understand that those problems exist, those dangers exist, and there are steps you can take to make yourself as safe as possible. And please don't listen to people that say, oh, that's victim blaming, girls shouldn't have to change their behaviour at all. We all have to do our best in life to like make a risk assessment, just like you would at work or, you know, in any other place. You make a risk assessment and then you come up with a safety strategy. And if that is, don't walk down the street at 12 o'clock at night on your own wearing a mini skirt. You know, I don't care what left-wing people or extreme feminists say, that's a pretty good safety strategy not to do that. Because you'll never change the fact that there will be some really unpleasant predators around that will magnetise them to you. And the argument that those predators shouldn't exist or that those predators should be stopped, great, it's a lovely argument in theory, but it's not realistic, because they do exist, they don't always get stopped, and you don't want to make yourself a victim for them. Thanks for watching. Let me know about your experiences on this topic below in the comments section. I always keep track of the comments, so I'll be fascinated to hear what you guys think. Keep it polite as always. You know, I will get rid of people that are just being abusive and ridiculous for no reason. Keep it constructive. Thanks for watching. Take care. Catch you next time.